Welcome back to the 20th Century History Podcast, Unit 2, and welcome Remote Learning 2.0. Hopefully you're having a great time at home and still engaged in history. So when we left school, we were looking at the post-war period, and we've started having a look at 1945, the fallout from the end of the Second World War, and the new world order, where we have East versus West. We have capitalism versus communism, and then the beginnings of the Cold War. We examined Yalta and Potsdam Conference and the machinations of those two, and it really did set the scene for pretty much the next century, for the rest of the century, really. Some would argue that the Cold War never ended. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about the impact that the nuclear bomb had on getting the Cold War sort of underway, and this kind of fear and, I suppose, competition that eventuated between the USSR and the USA. So as we know, during the Second World War, there was a Soviet spy network, and they were trying, obviously, to get some intel onto the Americans. And they actually found out about Project Manhattan, if you remember. Project Manhattan, of course, being the project to manufacture for the first time an atomic weapon. So, this was also a secret pretty much that the Allies weren't prepared to share with the Soviet Union. So once the Red Army came in through Germany, and we sort of had seen the fallout from nuclear weapons in Japan, basically the Soviet Union really decided that they too needed a nuke. So they set up a special unit to get their atomic bomb underway, and they actually had the chief of their secret police oversee this operation. It was called Operation Enormous. So they had hundreds of thousands of slave workers. Basically, they took them out of the gulag and they were put to work mining uranium ore. Yep, I doubt they would have much protective equipment. And basically, they were building infrastructure to support the project. So they had a secret research station that was built outside of Moscow, and the projects that scientists and their families basically lived in. So they were living large in comparison to your average Soviet. It was well-paid positions there, and the idea was that in 4 years they wanted to get their bomb manufactured, and it only actually took them 3 years earlier than the Americans expected. So one of the big things and the big features of the Cold War is espionage, so aka spying. So it also helped the Soviet Union build the bomb because they needed to know a few tips and tricks. And there's been quite a bit of debate amongst historians about how much spying actually sped up the process. Today they just hack. Today is a bit easier. Back in the day, you actually needed quite a vast network of spies in what we'd say enemy territory. So as part of Operation Enormous, there was 2 scientists who'd worked within the US Atomic Research Station, and they actually passed on research secrets to the Soviets, and they actually smuggled an A-bomb out by a courier. And this was all under the eyes of the FBI and the War Department. So basically, there's a bit of a trend with hacking at the moment, just like that Bitcoin hack by quite a young person. So a young Ted Hall, who was 19 years old, he was a physics prodigy at the time, and he was quite motivated by socialism and prompted him to give away state secrets effectively. So that helped, I suppose, reveal the secrets on how to actually manufacture this weapon. Now, living with the prospect of nuclear war meant that there was now an arms race on between the 2 superpowers, and they wanted to build bigger and better powerful weapons, as you do. So in 1952, we had the world's first hydrogen bomb detonated by the Americans in an atoll in the Pacific. And this massive mushroom cloud of the explosion actually spread hundreds of miles in diameter. And the atoll disappeared, and a crater about a mile wide and about 200 feet deep was left. So this is about 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. And about 9 months later, the Soviets tested a smaller device, and then the British detonated their nuclear device on a lovely atoll or an island in Australia. And they've, as you know, they did go out to the desert in Australia and let off quite a few. No protective equipment, unfortunately, for the Australians. The British, they took care of themselves. And then the French, of course, joined in. And then finally the Chinese in the 60s had started manufacturing weapons. So in 1961, we've got Soviet leader Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin on his death in 1953. And he announced that the USSR had actually detonated the world's largest bomb. It's a big, mine's bigger than yours competition going on here. So the bomb contained more explosive power than all the bombs exploded in the entire Second World War. So there were now nuclear devices in missiles, submarines, planes, military bases. Basically, the world was nuked up. So the targets really for America were cities of Russia. And then basically through the 60s, the Soviets really devoted, I think it was about a quarter of their GNP, or their gross domestic product, and a quarter of its workforce to build arms to basically catch up with America. And pretty much by about 1969, they were on an even playing field. So basically we have the Americans and the USSR who have a bomb of equal capacity. Pretty much they have that many nukes, we could effectively destroy the world. So this is a brand new way of life. So people were starting to live in fear that people who were perhaps not even-tempered may decide that instead of diplomatic politics, they would just nuke the living suitcase out of each other. So the idea was that, the both sides knew that a nuclear attack by either side would really see an instant response. So basically, if one dropped a bomb, the others would drop one back, and you just were assuring your own destruction. So there was an acronym called MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction, and it was actually coined by Kennedy and his administration to describe the military strategy where if one side launched an attack on the other, the enemy would retaliate with equal force, and basically both would be destroyed. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963, both sides came very, very close to nuclear conflict. And this was the first, tentative effort to try and get this nuclear proliferation under control. We will have a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in a bit more detail, and your SAC will actually be based upon this particular crisis. So there were millions of people who around the world who really were quite freaked out by the idea of a nuclear attack, and there were lots and lots of movements to actually ban nuclear weapons. So this was a whole new world. So for example, people were, like school children, would have to actually, they called it duck and cover, and they were taught how to prepare for a nuclear bomb. People had bunkers in their backyards with supplies. You thought hoarding toilet paper was intense now. You would have literally a bomb shelter in your backyard. And so this was all a reality. Now, we might look back now and say, oh my goodness, that's a bit extreme. Just think what the historians are going to think of our toilet paper wars. We look back, but we're not living in that time. This is a very real thing that at any moment, someone who loses their temper could potentially drop a bomb. So that's where we're really at this point in time. Okay, so there was a ban the bomb movement, began in the 50s in Britain, and people were really demanding that all these weapons were removed from Britain and America. And then there was a nuclear disarmament campaign, and it became quite influential. And it actually got quite a bit of support, basically where the NATO bases were. And the idea that the population was becoming sort of more aware of nuclear war sort of put pressure as well on politicians to maybe rein it in a bit. Okay, so we do know one thing, that nuclear weapons obviously are dangerous when they're dropped, but the people who are used in, for the manufacturing and things like that, we're talking about highly radioactive substances. And basically in 1954, a Japanese fishing boat was actually sprayed from so basically the Bikini Atoll, there was a hydrogen bomb, and 400 miles away, this fisherman actually died, and there was others who became ill from radiation poisoning. So there was another mid-air crash of a B-52 over Spain in 1966 because there was basically radioactive particles over farmland, and then crops were grown and they were actually contaminated and had to be destroyed. So it takes, I think, 200,000 years to get out of the soil and to be anywhere near safe. Often when there's been bombs dropped, we know, for example, there were high rates of cancer, particularly in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so we'll have a little bit of a look later on about nuclear proliferation treaties and the like. But this kind of gets us to the 1950s. Next time we're going to have a bit more of a look at the Cold War during the 1950s and some of the events. All right, see you next time.